We don't do influence. We build influence. Doing, to your point, sounds transactional. And that's what I think if we get away from, we allow ourselves the time. And it doesn't necessarily mean weeks or years. Sometimes it can mean the 15-minute meeting with the 3 power questions, right? It's the follow-up, but it's the building of influence.
Welcome to the Warriors at Work show. This is Jeannie Coomber, your guide and host. This is a show for men and women in the workplace who want to move from the predictable to the potent. This is your weekly dose of inspiration with an edge. I talk with CEOs and shamans, sports marketing executives and therapists. All of us are like-minded thinkers and doers who tell stories, share wisdom, and challenge each other to have the best life possible inside and outside the office. Welcome to your Warrior Conversation.
Hey everybody, it's Jeannie. Thank you so much for being back here with me at Warriors at Work. I'm so excited to bring to you a conversation with a dear friend and colleague, also an executive coach just like me, Brenda Knapp, who I've worked with for over a decade. I brought her into this space for a conversation around influence. She does a ton of work as part of her coaching practice around persuasion and influence. And as it's a key part of many of the executive coaching conversations I'm having with leaders, and I know she is as well, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to bring in her expertise and her perspective on what it is, what it's not, and how all of us can get better at the influence game. So I'm thrilled to bring to you a conversation with Brenda Knapp. Brenda Knapp, my dear friend, my dear colleague that I've known for a very long time. I'm thrilled to have you here with me in this conversation.
Oh, Jeannie, I couldn't be more delighted. I'm really happy to be here.
This is a conversation that we've never had. I've never really talked about your expertise and how you bring this word influence to life. And it's such a key part of our conversations as executive coaches. It's very often thrown into the leadership competency conversation. And it really can differentiate someone's level of success in an organization. But it's really thrown around a lot. So I'd love to just set the table first by having you tell us from your perspective as someone who's steeped in the subject, how do you define it? What is influence?
I'm smiling. I couldn't agree more. I know we've joked, but in the world of corporate buzzword bingo,
Yeah.
influence would be like the free space in the middle because you're right. It gets used and it means a lot of different things. It also gets interchanged a lot with the word impact. So what I notice when I'm working with executive coaching clients, doesn't matter if I'm talking to a principal at a startup fast scaling company, I'm talking to a mid-level manager elevating at, a Fortune 100. Everybody says, I want more influence. And when you really peel back the layers, what they want is impact. But you have to have influence to get to the impact piece. So I always use a pretty structured definition. And I always define influence as the act and art or power of producing an effect without apparent exertion of force or direct exercise of command. And when I ask people, what do you think of that? They always dial into that without the obvious force because that's the difference, right? And not to be a word nerd, but the word influence comes from influitum, Latin, which means to flow. So I love that imagery. I just got back from Jackson Hole and we're on a rafting trip. And I was really struck by when there are no impediments, right? How there's so much more ease. And that's how influence is. When
Mm.
we take out some of those impediments, some of them self-imposed, some organizationally, etc., there's an ease to things. And so that's how I like to think about it.
Ah, I love the word flow. Like,
Yeah.
that's the word I'd love to see us have more in the workplace and in leadership conversations. Like, what does ease and flow look like?
Mhm.
I love that. So, how did you know in your career that wow, this was something that you had some ease and flow or some skill around? Like, what was the moment or the experience that led to like the now?
Mm. I don't know if there was one moment. As I think about just my career in general and the length of it, that common theme of influence, like I started right out of undergrad in the ultimate influence job in a global ad agency.
Mm,
And I was trained in media strategy and buying. So what that meant is I learned about negotiation by being beat up by the TV reps, right? Because we worked at this big organization, we had a lot of money, really more than we should have handled at that time, and we got into these negotiations on behalf of our clients. So that was my first introduction, and now in hindsight, I realize how incredibly high level and valuable that was. I then pretty quickly decided I think I would be better suited and enjoy the other side of the desk more. So then I
mm,
went to the media sales side of things. And that's where I spent really the first half of my career. And it was interesting. I mean, not to date myself, but I worked on the launch of the last weekly magazine in America, Entertainment Weekly. And it was at that time, I mean, we were selling an audience. We were selling this idea that pop culture, people were going to really care about it. And we did, we also owned,
mm.
People Magazine and other things. But this idea that the entertainment business and how we interacted with media was going to change dramatically and become much more personal, and you were going to need a guide to it. So it was a big picture kind of sell. And then the second half of my career, obviously, I've been in executive coaching and facilitation. But that influence piece around how do you make things easier? How do you bring other people along willingly? That just kind of came naturally to me, and I started to see how that could not only benefit myself, but
Mm.
how I could help others.
And the removing impediments. I mean, just it being in that role, like you had to listen, really understand where they were coming from, and then try to figure out how do I make this easy? How do I create flow here?
Right. And the idea that there were some things you could do to make it easier that were similar to some of the work we do around present skills and behaviors that
Mm,
if you practice them, you could get better at it. The idea that this being influential or having that was more inbred versus learned. And as I
mm.
started working with teams, both as a leader of teams and then as a coach, you started to realize there were things that you could separate out.
Okay, got it. So when you think about the coaching work, so bring us into present day, what what are you hearing in a conversation
Mm.
that highlights for you, oh, this we have to work on influence. This is what we have to drop into. This is the skill they really need. Because I think a lot of people don't even have the consciousness into it. They think I have the skills, I have the authority in terms of level and label,
Yeah.
and I can't figure out why I'm not having more success or I'm not getting promoted or I'm running into lots of impediments. Like what is it? What do you hear that makes you know, "Oh, I got to drop in. We're going to talk about influence."
Oftentimes it's around some sort of angst or struggle. And usually they are identifying another person or a cross-functional team. Supply chain is so difficult, right? When we have to work with X, it never goes well, right? So usually it's the identification of a pain point that has a person or team of people attached to it. Because foundationally, I mean, here's the basis of everything I build on. The strength of your influence is directly related to the strength of your relationships.
Mm.
And if you buy into that, like I buy into that, you very quickly start to look at problems or pain points in a business situation and do a relationship diagnostic. So, like when someone comes to me for a leadership development 6-month engagement, and we're hearing about this idea of wanting more influence, and what does that look like? The first phase that I do with them and their leader is a discovery phase, which is at its core answering the question, what do you need to be different? Like, what is it specifically you need to be better at individually, collectively, organizationally that will allow us to make things easier, right? And because some of the things we do, we're getting in our own way. So that discovery phase is really, really critical. And part of that is talking to people. I mean, you can look at a 360, you do this work. You can, hear from the HR people what needs to change. But what I do is have people make a visual stakeholder map, right? So you ask the question, how do you know? I say, so where are things easy? Where are things difficult? Like draw it out for me, where you sit. And then kind of identify those hot spots, if you will, where there's difficulty. Now let's dig into that. Talk to me about the people, the leaders, the influence personas there that you have to interact with. Those are the people I want to talk to because they're going to help us know what you need to be better at to be more effective.
I love that. So you're really honing in on that what you just said before, which is influence is very much determined by the strength of your relationships. So you can assess like really an area of need based upon where they're having flow, where they're having impediments and resistance, and then really sink into, well, why is what's working really well? Why is it working well?
That's right.
And then what's not? And in terms of like brass tactics. So I'd love to get inside Brenda's brain for a minute. And so let's say I tell you I've got an impediment with a peer of mine in another functional area, and we have opposite styles. Help me to understand, like, how would you unpack it and how would you help me move through it?
So I think taking a practical approach is always the best. And I always try to separate out for people, for themselves, and as they're anticipating an influence situation, what's above the water. If you use that, we'll keep with our water visualization,
Yeah.
the iceberg that's sticking out above. So what it is people want. And
Mm,
then what's below the surface, which, as we all know, is often deeper, but we just can't see it. And that's really
mm,
the motivation drivers, dare I say, fears that are going on, right? For you and for the other person. So the first thing I talk about is let's talk about this relationship. Like, what is it you need? What is your position? What else is going on here? Right? If
mm.
you're being on, I'm not saying you're going to share it with that person, but as a leader, you need to acknowledge that. I think about a simple sales example when there's a transformation and they're going to rejigger everything, and you're leading a team of people. Your position is you don't want to lose any resources.
Right.
But what's going on under the surface is what is this? What does this all mean? Am I losing power? How are my people going to get paid? Right? And if we could just acknowledge what else is going on, whether we have to do it with the other person or not, I think it frees us up to be in a different kind of conversation. So
Yeah.
that's the first piece. The second, I mean, I have a friend up at Northwestern, Paul Corona, and he does work around relationships, but I think it's really about influence. And the cut to the chase is he talks about, as humans, we always want to talk, take, and tell. when we should be asking, listening, and giving. And
Mm,
in the world of influence, it's that relationship development that makes all the difference, right? Because if people don't trust you, that's the impediment most often in the flow is
yeah.
some level of distrust. So
Yes.
if you can have the courage to figure out what that's about,
Mm.
you've got a lot better
I
chance.
I love what you said is basically you're really giving the space to surface where's the real resistance? What's really in the way of your flow?
Yeah.
It's never about your technical skills or your ability to get things accomplished. Again, traditional leadership competencies, the rub is always like it's always a personality thing. I can't get, they give, they take, they don't do. But what's really going on underneath that? I just love that.
The,
Love
the,
that.
the other word that I think is important here, Jeannie, in that discovery or diagnostic stage is what assumptions am I making?
Mm,
And interestingly, what I see with my executive coaching clients is when someone's been in an organization a long time, we think they have more credibility and they've been around, everyone knows them. That's right. But
mhm.
also, they've been around and everyone knows them. So people make assumptions about how Brenda operates, which may or may not be true in this new expanded role. So I think it's really important to ask yourself, what assumptions am I making going into this interaction? And what assumptions might others be making about me based on my experience, track record, etc. And a good way to think about that, I think, just from a practical standpoint, is think about a situation that you have that didn't go well
Mm,
and unpack that. Like, what were your assumptions going into it? And often what I hear is, well, I assumed because they're in marketing, they would be supportive of this, affiliate plan. That was an assumption that was 100% wrong.
right.
So just doing what Cialdini is kind of the godfather of influence research. He talks about persuasion and persuasion.
Hmm.
Persuasion is what's going on the days, weeks, months ahead. I translate that into trust and relationship building and learning that prepares you for the persuasion. The
Yeah.
in the moment, here's how we're going to go. But one without the other is not as effective.
Would you say, because one of the other things that when we were preparing for this, what I loved is this idea that it's about seeking to truly understand and not necessarily driving forward your own agenda, your own objective. I mean, the assumptions piece is part of it. It's like that self reflection around what assumptions am I making going into this. I'd love for you to say more around the seeking to understand, because it's probably the hardest thing to do, especially when there's time constraints or there's ego, where we just
Mm.
want to drive, we want to complete, we want to execute and move on, or we don't want to be wrong. So seeking to understand feels like a slowdown,
Mhm.
or I don't know. Say more about it.
Yeah. Yes. Seeking to understand sounds very altruistic, and I buy into all that. But I think in a business translation, sometimes if we think about it, is just more due diligence or more information gathering
Mm,
that can make it easier. um, so sometimes, just in terms of coaching people as they're prepping, I'll say, you've worked so hard on this pitch or this pre-preparation. I would worry less about the 3 points you have to make, at least at this stage of it. And I think more deeply about what are the 3 things I need to understand better
mm,
in order to be a more collaborative problem solver, right? And I know you dial into language. That's different languaging, that's different framing, that's a different mindset then what do I have to do to win here? It's what do I have to understand to get us to a point of flow more naturally?
Oh, I love that. That's a subtle shift that is so profound. It gets you out of the term that I'll often use is we live very much in transactional space, which is very constrictive. What you're saying has much more of an expansive texture to it.
That's right.
Because if I start to think about what are the things that I need to understand to get me to that execution or to that result versus what are the things that I need to check off and accomplish in this conversation. So it's very subtle, but it's so much more partner oriented, which
Yeah.
I know obviously we both do a lot of the presence work, which speaks to, the credibility and as well as the rapport and the connection. I'd love to hear your perspective on how that plays because now we're going to get to the delivery. So now I've done the self-study.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
armed with my what do I need to do to be more in the inquiry here? Share your perspective on how things like credibility and connection play in.
Yeah. I also I want to just build on something you just said, which is the idea that we don't do influence. We build influence.
Mm.
Doing, to your point, sounds transactional. And that's what I think if we get away from, we allow ourselves the time. And it doesn't necessarily mean weeks or years. Sometimes it can mean the 15-minute meeting with the 3 power questions, right? It's the follow-up, but it's the building of influence. And in terms of how presence fits in, I mean, we talk about it all the time. There is both the credibility piece. You've got to know what you're talking about to have influence, right? People have to believe you and buy into it. They also have to see that there's a value for them. That's just human beings. The other piece is the connection piece, and they need to feel like you have not only your best interests, but theirs as well. And that's where the questioning and the deepening of conversation happens. I'll give you a different example because it's just happened and it's in a different area of my life. So, is in another area of my life, I do hospice work. And so I go in and I support families and patients at end of life. I am a volunteer in this arena. So, but I was thinking the other day about how quickly, if I want to have any influence, and by influence, I mean being able to be present and hold space for them, not help them make a decision, but that is being influential. And how I very quickly have to have them know this isn't my first rodeo. I have been in these situations before. I understand how to interact with a healthcare worker in a way that is meaningful, as well as I understand that this is a unique and human and very personal situation. And I have empathy and care for this, right? But to go in and just be empathetic and connected is not really what they need, right? So that it just showed me in a different arena what the power of both credibility and connection in terms of presence allows you, kind of opens the door for you to build influence and ultimately have impact.
It's a beautiful story. It's beautiful story. And it's a different take on sort of the traditional when you think of influence.
Yeah.
It's really showing up with more of a relationship to our humanness.
And dare I use the word, Jeannie, authenticity.
Yeah.
But, you know, we asking questions, deepening, trying to seeking first to understand. We in the business arena certainly are still getting comfortable with that idea of, does that make me vulnerable? Does that expose me in a way that undercuts me? Or does it open things in a way that helps us make better connections and better decisions. And so at the crux of when we're working with people, it's figuring out how much of yourself do you bring and when. And that sounds, when I say it aloud, that sounds almost manipulative, but I think it's strategic, right? Back to connection and competency. People have to believe. People follow people who see them, who hear them, who value them. And that's the difference.
You know what I think of too, like in high stress
Mhm.
situations, high stakes situations, the behaviors that often surface are more command control, overcompetence. It's much less of what we're talking about. But even just using that framing of what are three questions that
Mhm.
I have, like powerful questions that I would have to help me to truly understand what I don't know.
That's true. I also think back to the idea that we build influence, we don't do it.
Mm,
If you've done a little bit of this, and then you can be transparent situationally, people can not just tolerate the command and control, they can welcome it. Because why?
mm,
Because they trust you. I don't mind when someone, especially in a high stress, serious situation, I welcome someone I trust taking control. I don't welcome someone I don't trust taking control. So I think what changes in those situations sometimes is the need for transparency and the pacing, right? Of
mm.
how you have to shorten that gap between information gathering and execution.
Yeah, information gap. Oh, that's so good. So, what are the biggest derailers? Right? Because obviously, everyone that's listening or watching here are business professionals. They're thinking of, all right, what are my takeaways? What's the stuff I better not do? We talked a lot about all the things that I we could be doing or doing better. What are the derailers?
Like in so many things, I think the top derailers are distraction. So allowing ourselves, not putting ourselves in a situation to be able to be fully focused, whatever that looks like. Assumptions that we make about ourselves or the other people, but I think the ones we make about ourselves, if you can't influence yourself, you're going to have a hard time influencing others. So when we start making assumptions that there's someone in the meeting who has more experience, more to say,
Mm,
uh, more of a right to say it, we're not helping ourselves, right?
right.
Like, and and those are things that we can shift, right? And I was talking to a younger leader the other day, and he was questioning himself about, I should have said this, I should have said that. And someone else threw in an idea. And he said it wasn't that great, but it opened the door for the other people to build on it. And
Mm,
just that awareness, you have something to, if you're in the meeting, you've got something to add. Maybe it's the powerful question. Um, but I think we get in our own way about making assumptions that someone
mm,
else has more expertise, more insight than we do. We have to drop that. Uh, the other would be just willingness to have a few extra touch points, because I hear what you're saying. In high stress, the people we work with, this time for relationship development, like that starts to sound a little soft.
mhm,
I would translate it into touch points. If you are a leader, you are always on stage in every meeting, in every transaction, in every conversation. So make sure you make the most of those touch points because they matter. But they don't have to be extended. They have to be intentional.
mhm. Well, the other thing that's interesting about this is like not only is it what you really have surfaced for me is like it's the consciousness around what we're doing and how we're doing it really can make a huge difference. And what I would say to add to the derailer is watch out for lazy leadership,
Ah, yes.
where there's lazy moments of that's going to take too much time. I don't feel like asking a question. I'm tired, or my ego is very present and I want to be right. Check yourself before you're going into an interaction and say, where am I right now? How am I feeling? Like, what's really going on? Because when we're unconscious, we can get sloppy and make mistakes, and we're all guilty of it, right? And then you're in the apology train. Okay, who do I have to apologize for? I
Yeah.
apologize. I'm so sorry that went wrong, and then that has a trickle effect, particularly in higher stakes situations. So that would be the one thing that I would add.
Yeah, right. When you have to ask yourself, do I want to be right or do I want to be effective?
Yes,
And God, it feels so good to be right.
it
But
does.
as the higher up you go, the less room you have for that. You just got to keep the forward motion.
Yeah.
And do I have to be 100% right? In some businesses, you do.
Mm,
In many, you do not.
yes. And
So
even
being clear on what those are,
well, yeah, there are situations where
of course.
90% correct will not fly, but in many situations, reducing the assumptions, all the things that we've just talked about here, and showing up with powerful questions, but I think just that consciousness of where am I right now is a huge time saver, and also allows for you to be more effective. My last question for you is, when you think about the influence conversation, like, who do you follow? Who do you admire and why?
So many. The top 3, I think, at least for your listeners, that are would be helpful. I am a big Adam Grant fan, and I'll tell you why. Many people, certainly I talk about him. He's an organizational psychologist out of Wharton, but he has a wonderful social media presence. And what I like about what he does is there's an accessibility to it. I
Mm,
can be talking about it with an EVP client, or I can be talking about it with my neighbor over a cocktail in the backyard. There's an accessibility to how do we use human interactions to push our agenda forward. And I love that. And he's got just great little kind of
yes.
pithy sound bites that you can grab onto and return to. So I love him. I also am a big Carla Harris fan. She's a vice chairman
Yes.
out of Morgan Stanley. And she wrote Lead to Win and Expect to Win. And what I love about her work is everything she does is through an inclusive lens. Like, she's always thinking about how do we broaden the aperture around the conversation, and
Mm,
how do we invite more people in. And I think that's just so timely. And especially with a lot of the people I work with, where we have to be intentional around continuing
yeah.
to hold those doors open when that takes intentionality. And I think she does such a beautiful job of not only showing us how to do it, but showing us the value, why
Yeah.
it matters to the business. So I love her. And then the last one is a woman. Her name is Maury Tarapur. She's really a negotiation expert. She wrote Bring Yourself: How to Harness the Power of Connection to Negotiate Fearlessly. But what I like about her is, again, her focus on the human and the
Mm,
ability to bring your whole self, and if done strategically, it makes a difference. But she kind of flips the whole idea of winning and losing and the binariness of negotiation and influence. She just busts that whole thing apart. She's a great follow.
oh, I love that. What a great way to wrap up this conversation. Brenda, I just took copious notes. You had some really, really terrific things here. I feel so lucky and grateful to know you and have you in my circle. And I'm thrilled to be able to bring your genius out into the community that I serve here at Warriors at Work. So thank you so much for being here.
It is absolutely my pleasure. Anytime you get to talk to a friend and colleague about how do we deepen connections and increase our impact, regardless of what area you're operating in, that I feel good about. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Brenda.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Warriors at Work show. If you are interested in learning more about what we do at the Warriors at Work show and platform, be sure to go over to my website, Jeannie Coomber, and subscribe to my monthly Warrior Playbook newsletter. I share everything that I'm up to month by month, as well as some lessons and insights that I've learned. I'm also interested in hearing any feedback you have about this conversation or future topics. So reach out to me directly on jc@jeanniecoomber.com or on LinkedIn. Be sure to tell your friends and your colleagues about this Warriors at Work conversation. Subscribe, review, and rate us. It's the best way to get this message out into the world. Be well.